Fall is supposed to be comforting crisp air, glowing leaves, quiet nights. But every October, when daylight fades early and the woods grow darker than they should, something else stirs. The final delivery. This happened last fall. It was late in the season, almost winter, and where Travis lived, it got brutally cold. They even got snow sometimes in October. He had been doing food delivery for 3 years, and he was out working around 10 p.m. that night. The snow was just beginning to fall. It was one of the first snowfalls, which meant everyone was likely skittish about driving. Travis was one of the few cars on the road, but a lot of orders were coming in. As soon as he finished one, another would pop up. After driving around everywhere until almost 1 a.m., he took up one last order. The snow was starting to pick up, and Travis was running on fumes. He drove through the McDonald's, picked up the food, and set in the directions to the house. It was close, about 10 minutes away, but he didn't consider the direction it was in before accepting the order. It was opposite from where he lived, and he was already a good 25 minutes from home, so it was going to be a long drive back. Annoyed at himself, Travis turned out of the parking lot and onto the road. The plow trucks still weren't out, probably because they weren't expecting this much snowfall, but his SUV was usually good in the snow, so he wasn't that nervous. While he was driving, he noticed the road he was heading down was about to leave the main area of town. He checked the map again. It said to go this way, but the route was gravely unusual. He didn't even know any houses existed down here. This road only served as a connector to the highway that led out of state. He went down for a few minutes, seeing only streetlights and trees, until he reached the turn. It was a single small street leading off the main road. Travis slowed down, being extra careful since this street was smaller and had trees lined up right beside it. Sliding off would guarantee a terrible night. As he made his way down, he saw a few long driveways leading to faint lights far out in the trees. The driveway he was to turn down looked like all the others. He slowly drove through it until he made it to the house. The house was medium-sized and older, completely covered in snow. It was entirely unremarkable, except for its remote locations stranded out here in the middle of a dense forest. Travis parked out front, got the bag, and started walking up to the door. The snow was thicker than he would have liked, soaking his shoes and the lower legs of his pants. When he got up to the porch, he knocked and started to set the bag down, but almost immediately the door swung open. He looked up, seeing a large, imposing man in a winter jacket. His face was unsettlingly pale, as if he had been standing out in the cold for hours. "I got your order right here," Travis said nervously, holding the bag up. After a moment, the man stepped back and opened the door wider. "You can set it down right over there." He lifted his arm and pointed toward what Travis assumed was the kitchen. The way he said it was less a suggestion and more a quiet demand, and every instinct in Travis' body screamed that stepping inside would be a critical mistake. Travis looked at the man's hand. She wasn't holding anything, so there was no logical reason for him to do anything other than hand over the bag. "Sorry, but I really have to get going," he said, holding the bag up again. The man's face dropped into a frown, and then he suddenly slammed the door shut. Now utterly shocked by his reaction, Travis quickly set the bag down on the porch and bolted back toward his car. But just as he got past the front yard, he heard something from behind him. He turned around, realizing the noise was coming from somewhere on the other side of the house. It could have been a back door or something, but it was too muffled to hear clearly. Getting creeped out, Travis walked quicker and got in his car. He switched it on, and right as he looked up, he saw the man coming around the side of his house and making his way quickly over to the car. He had something in his hands. It looked like rope, thick and coiled, but there was also a glint of something metallic that Travis couldn't clearly make out. His heartbeat spiked, and adrenaline took over his body. He started going in reverse, trying his hardest to go quick, while also not getting stuck in the snow. The man got close, probably just a few feet away, before Travis' car was able to grip the road and start picking up some speed. He backed up through the whole driveway, seeing the man eventually stop and watch, slowly fading into the dark as he backed up onto the street. Travis still didn't know what the man was doing or what he intended to do with that rope. Honestly, the whole thing was just terrifying and confusing enough to make him not even want to think about it. He still did food deliveries, but He was far more cautious, and most of the time, he didn't even knock on the doors anymore. He just dropped the food on the porch and left. Had he stayed any longer that night, or had he entered the house, there was no telling what would have happened to him. The fresh lock. Last year, Darren was 16, and his friend Leon and he were hanging out a couple of days before Halloween trying to figure out what to do. They felt too old for trick-or-treating, but they still wanted something edgy and memorable for the holiday. They tossed around a few ideas until Darren thought of the perfect plan. They should explore the abandoned farm they both knew about. It would be eerie and thrilling, exactly what they wanted. Compared to their other ideas, this one was the best by a long shot. Leon was excited about it too, but they agreed that other people would probably have the same idea on October 31st. Instead, they chose to go on the night before. They just wanted to explore and maybe be a little bit spooked, then leave. They didn't want to risk running into anyone crazy at a place like that. On the 30th, Leon drove them out to the neighborhood nearby and parked on the road. They walked through the houses until they reached the street that turned into a gravel path. This was the driveway leading up to the farm. Darren had only ever seen the place during the day, but it was just a large field with a typical wooden barn and a single-story home. From the edge of the path, both structures were swallowed by the night. Their flashlights could only cut a thin swath of light a few feet ahead as they started making their way down the gravel driveway. It was instantly darker than they expected. Once they started getting closer, they could see the outline of the barn on the left and the house further back at the end of the driveway. They were more interested in the house, figuring the barn was probably completely empty and boring. They kept walking until they reached the clearing of the tall grass. The clearing was a circle of dirt and short grass that went around the house's perimeter. As they approached the front, they passed by some large farming equipment, old rusting tractor-looking things that had been left out for years. Even with their dim flashlights, the equipment looked eaten away by rust. When they got up to the porch, they saw that the entrance had been entirely sealed, the door replaced by a solid wooden board. Every window and door was sealed and covered. Disappointed, they went back to the front of the house to rethink their plan. As they stood there, Darren noticed the path leading up to the barn. It wasn't an actual path. It was more like just a line of flattened grass. With nothing else to do, they started heading for the barn. But the atmosphere was tangibly different compared to the house. A profound, growing sense of dread clung to the air as they approached. When they reached it, the large door was already wide open. Darren walked in first, and Leon followed behind, both shining their flashlights around. It only took a couple of seconds for a horrid smell to hit them, though it was a barn, so it wasn't exactly surprising. But then Darren noticed something else. There were footprints all over the ground, but these weren't the scuff marks of teenagers. They were heavy, deliberate boot prints, tracking in a clean, disturbing line back and forth from a single point on the opposite side of the barn. Darren saw in Leon's eyes that he was just as freaked out as he was, but they quickly realized this wasn't the kind of scare they were looking for. They slowly walked in line with the footprints, which led to a wooden cellar hatch that was blended in with the floor. The only noticeable thing other than the clear footsteps was a shiny, new, gleaming padlock that held the hatch shut. The stark contrast between the old dusty floor and the fresh silver lock was chilling. Before Darren could process it, a violent, deafening thud shook the entire barn. They spun around, seeing the door had been slammed shut behind them. Leon sprinted over and shoved the door back open. They both looked around outside, but didn't see anyone. Now utterly terrified, they booked it straight through the tall grass back to the gravel driveway, then sprinted to the neighborhood where the car was. They definitely got the scare they were looking for, maybe even too much so. Neither of them ever tried to figure out what really happened that night, but a couple of months later, they saw that the house and barn had been completely blocked off. They tried to look up why, but there was no word publicly about it. What was going on there remains a mystery, but Darren couldn't shake the thought. If they had stayed to find out, they may have never left. The Decoration Stalker. It was the fall of 2018 when this happened to Evan. Fall had just started, and around there the weather had become cool and breezy, definitely his favorite season. That year was no different. Around early October, he went out and bought some Halloween decorations before work, planning to set them up outside once he got home. Due to a coworker calling out, though, he had to stay late and didn't finish work until 7. Evan drove home as quickly as he could and started getting to work immediately. It was pretty dark out, but with his outdoor lights on, the darkness wasn't too bad. He started by setting up the orange lights on his bushes, and as he did, a guy suddenly came around the side of his house. The man startled him badly, just appearing without a word. Evan found his presence highly invasive, so he snapped at him. "Hey, you're on my property, you need to leave now." The guy looked at Evan with an expressionless face, said, "Sure thing," and started wandering toward the road. He looked about 40, with short brown hair, acting with a disturbing lack of purpose, almost like he was homeless or completely lost. Evan continued with the lights, but he couldn't help but notice that the man never really left. He stayed on the other side of the road wandering, and several times Evan caught him looking directly over at him. It was deeply creepy, and Evan ended up just going inside after finishing the lights. He tried to tell himself it was just a harmless, confused man, and went on with his night. He made dinner and went up to his room to watch TV. As he lay in bed, the silence was broken by something below him. It was a slow, deliberate grating sound like something heavy being slowly dragged across the floor. He paused the TV but couldn't hear it anymore. On any normal day, he probably wouldn't even check, but having seen that guy earlier, Evan just had a weird feeling, so he got up and walked downstairs. Strangely, he noticed right away that all the lights were off, which he could have sworn he hadn't turned off yet. He walked a little farther into the hallway, flicking on the overhead light, then stopping to listen again. It was still quiet. However, there was a low ambient noise. It was wind howling through the rooms. Evan walked to the back of the house, where the sight made his stomach clench with panic. The sliding back door was wide open. He realized, with sickening clarity, that the grating sound he heard was someone slowly pulling that heavy door open. At this point, Evan couldn't think straight. He wasn't even sure if someone had actually entered his home. His adrenaline pumping, he called out, "Hello? Who's there?" He walked up to the door and looked outside quickly, not seeing anyone. Then he turned back around, and against the far wall of the dark room, he spotted the faintest, motionless silhouette of a person. They were completely swallowed by darkness. Evan let out a literal gasp when he saw them, and by doing that, he thought he'd unintentionally shown them that their cover was blown, because immediately after, the man came running at him. Evan only saw him in the light for a fraction of a second before running out the door, but he was certain it was the same man he'd encountered earlier. As he bolted through his backyard, he could hear the man's footsteps pounding, gaining ground right behind him. He ran up to the closest house and started banging frantically on the door, screaming for help. Luckily, they opened up somewhat quickly, and as Evan entered their home, the man stood in their front yard and just stared him down. They called the police, but the guy had run off. It was pretty clear to Evan that while he was at work that day, the man had broken the lock on his door. Then, during the night, he tried to sneak inside his home. Had Evan not heard the door opening, or not noticed him hiding in the dark, who knows what he would have done that night. The man was only imprisoned for a few weeks due to not being sober during his actions. So, Evan was left to just worry about whether or not he intended on coming back. The Trail Walker. This happened several years ago in early October. Wayne had 2 weeks off work and had taken a trip down to a cabin in the hills outside his city. It was an Airbnb that was truly remote, which was perfect because he wanted to spend a few days camping as well. He drove 2 hours to the cabin and arrived that afternoon. The silence was immediate and profound. There were no other cabins or buildings in sight, just an unbroken expanse of surrounding woods. Wayne set his things inside and looked through the rooms. The place was small and unremarkable, but it had a cozy, old-fashioned feel to it. It wasn't his usual style, but it was a nice change of environment for a vacation. The rest of that night and the following few days went by with nothing of interest. He spent his time relaxing, sitting outside in the cold fall weather for most of the days, and enjoying the nights inside by the fireplace. However, on the 5th day, he finally set out with his camping gear. Wayne wasn't sure exactly how long he was going to camp for, but he planned for 2 to 3 nights. He was aware of a couple of trails nearby from planning ahead, but only one of them connected directly to the cabin. To keep things simple, he chose to just take that one. He walked for at least 3 or 4 hours before he found a clearing he was happy with. It was the only one he'd encountered, but his gut instinct screamed against camping directly on the trail. Night was closing in already, so he quickly got his tent up and started a fire. As it got darker, Wayne put on his heavy sweater and jacket. The cold was really starting to settle in. He sat out by the fire for an hour, eating a quick meal and waiting to get sleepy. But at some point while he was sitting there, his eyes caught sight of something. A dark, indistinct figure moving through the trees. He watched as they walked through the dark. No flashlight, no apparent path. They simply moved and disappeared into the distance. The only light in the woods was his campfire, aside from the dim moonlight, so whoever was out there must have seen him. The way they moved was utterly bizarre and no light, not even following the trail. Who was out here, moving like that, 4 hours from the nearest road? It made Wayne feel so unnerved that he immediately thought about taking the long walk back to the cabin, but he knew it wasn't safe to hike that late into the night. He stayed on watch for a half hour, checking everywhere, but saw no more signs of the person. After a while, he started getting tired, so he flattened the fire and let it burn out. But just as the glow of the campfire finally surrendered to ashes, he heard it. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, coming from the blackness to the left of the campsite. Wayne's eyes widened, straining to adjust to the dark, but he could only see a few feet ahead. The footsteps grew louder coming toward the campsite, getting close enough for him to think they were just outside of his sight. But then they walked slightly off, staying in the shadows and passing by, then continuing to walk away. They never stopped or did anything to acknowledge he was there, but the odds of someone being out here at that exact place he was simply impossible to be a coincidence. Once the footsteps were gone, Wayne took out his flashlight, disassembled his tent, and packed his things. It wasn't ideal, but he could sense that something deeply wrong was happening. He walked quickly, keeping his flashlight focused on the trail and trying to keep himself calm. The woods were now so quiet, only adding to the terrifying eeriness of the situation. Though he had his doubts, Wayne eventually made it back to the cabin. It was still well into the night, and after walking so much that day, on no sleep, he passed out on the couch just minutes after getting inside. His mind was so foggy. He felt a surge of relief. 4 hours of walking had put a safe distance between him and whatever was out there. Being so far away, he didn't feel he really had reason to be scared anymore. As he was passed out, though, Wayne groggily woke up to a strange sound, something on the other side of the cabin like wood scraping against the walls. His eyes shot open and he whipped his head around to face the back of the room. A man was slowly prying open the window. The instant Wayne stood up, the man's eyes locked onto his. There was no hesitation. The intruder dropped the sash and vanished into the trees. Wayne got everything together and immediately left the cabin, driving to a hotel in a nearby town. Obviously, he still didn't know who that man was or what he was doing out there. But clearly, the stranger had followed him and tried to get inside the cabin while he was sleeping. If he had, there's no telling what would have happened. Synchronized footsteps. Lucas' family owned a huge plot of land full of trees, and on the edge of the property, they had built a cabin. Compared to the main house, the cabin felt much more closed off and isolated in the woods. That year, Lucas took a trip up there around the end of October to see his parents and siblings. Since the house was full, he volunteered to stay at the cabin for the few days he was there. This was the first day he arrived on the property. There wasn't a drivable road to get to the cabin, so he parked at the main house. All he had was a light backpack with his things, and since he only planned on sleeping there, he didn't bother making a separate trip just to drop the bag off. Around 5 p.m., they had what Lucas guessed was a small party, as it was the first time in a while that all of them were together. They had some food and drinks and shared updates on their lives. It was a good time, but it definitely drained his energy after a few hours. He told them he was going to head out to the cabin for the night and get ready for bed, so he threw his backpack on and left through the back door. The trail to get there was very thin and about a 10-minute walk. He hadn't even thought about the dark, though. Lucas stepped into the blackness without thinking about how dark it would be, and had to use his phone's flashlight just to see where he was stepping. A little ways down, he randomly heard a stick snap behind him. He turned and looked at the path, but his phone light was awful and barely lit up anything. He figured it was nothing and kept walking. Only a couple of seconds later, though, he heard it again. The sound was sickeningly synchronized. As soon as his foot moved, something behind him moved too. He was being followed. "Who's out there?" "Alex, I know it's you." "Not funny, bro," he called out, hoping it was just his brother being annoying. But Lucas knew if it was Alex, he would have been cracking up by now. He felt really uneasy, as the suspense of not being able to see anything really started getting to him. He kept walking, moving faster now. He heard leaves crunch several times as he continued making his way to the cabin, though he didn't turn around, knowing he wouldn't see anything anyway. He told himself his mind was playing tricks. Maybe he'd had too much to drink. But whatever it was, pure panic fueled his rush to the cabin. He finally made it. He unlocked the door and got in, locking it behind him. After tossing his bag on the floor, he rubbed his face out of stress from whatever he'd just experienced. And just then, a subtle sound came from the other side of the door. The handle slowly, deliberately turned. The instant whoever it was realized it was locked, they began pounding relentlessly on the wood. Not just knocks, but full-on, violent hitting. Lucas almost stumbled backward from the sheer jump scare. They kept banging on the door, and with nothing else to do, he walked up and looked out the thin window on the side of the door to see who it was. When he did, he saw a large man wearing a dark jacket and heavy boots, a stranger he'd never seen before. The man's face was inches from the glass. Lucas only looked for a moment before the stranger's eyes snapped to his. The man's eyes were ablaze with pure, unadulterated rage, and he immediately followed up by smashing his fists against the window. Then, thankfully, a voice yelled from the woods. The man paused, then sprinted in the opposite direction. About 30 seconds later, Lucas checked out the window and saw his brother Alex running up to the cabin. He guessed Alex had happened to see the guy come up behind him as he started walking to the cabin, and after asking their parents if they knew him, Alex had immediately come running for him. To this day, they've never seen that man again and don't know what he was doing out in the woods on their property, or why he was stalking Lucas. That night still scares the hell out of him to think about. The Backyard Stalker. This happened a couple of days before Halloween. Brandon finally had the next few days off work, and he was looking forward to staying up late and simply decompressing, just him, some fast food, and Netflix on the couch. He picked up some fast food on the way home, eating on the couch while watching a show. About 30 minutes in, he paused it and got up to throw out the rest of the food. Brandon walked into the kitchen and tossed it, but when he turned around, his breath-hitched figure was standing in his backyard. The man was just looking at the house, not really doing anything else. For context, Brandon's backyard was small, but it was completely fenced in, so there was no way the stranger had just stumbled through while taking a shortcut or something. Brandon quickly flipped on the back porch light and slid the door open. He yelled at the figure. With the porch light now on, Brandon could see his face. The man was young, probably in his 20s, but his eyes were dark, utterly hollow and unnerving. He didn't respond to Brandon, so Brandon called out again, louder. "You need to leave. This is my property." The guy looked over at him, then casually started walking toward the gate. Brandon made sure he left, going to the front window and watching him walk down the street. Once the man had vanished, Brandon stood there, reeling from the sheer bizarre nature of the encounter. Why was he there? He was just staring at the house for seemingly no reason. Brandon even went as far as to go out into the backyard and stand in the same place the stranger had been, looking up at the house to see what he could have been looking at. But there really wasn't anything. He went back inside and tried to shake it off. Brandon poured himself a drink and sat back down, playing the show. He had finished the episode and just started the next one. Maybe 20 minutes had gone by when he heard it. A series of frantic, muffled footsteps running in the backyard, followed by a violent thud against the house. Brandon jumped up and sprinted to the kitchen, where he saw him again, that same guy, now pressed against the glass back door. He was violently straining against the frame, aggressively trying to rip the door open. Brandon grabbed the handle from his side, just in case the man somehow broke the lock. But seeing the sheer rage and madness in the man's eyes up close was horrifying. Brandon backed away and got his phone, dialing the police as he stood in the kitchen and watched this guy continue trying to get in. But then the man just stopped. He stared at Brandon through the glass door, breathing heavily and still having that crazed look in his eyes. Then he walked back to the gate, but this time, he didn't walk away. He stayed somewhere on the side of the house like he was hiding. Brandon paced constantly between all the windows, waiting for the police to arrive and hoping the man wouldn't try anything else. 5 minutes went by with no sounds or movement before a police car showed up. Right away, Brandon heard footsteps running from the side of the house, but not away from the house. The man ran back up to the door and tried to force it open again. He chose to attempt breaking in again, defying the chance to run. Obviously, the police were able to catch him in the act, and after a quick struggle, they got him cuffed and into the car. When questioned, it was very apparent that the man was under the influence of something heavy, and it was later confirmed with tests. Despite questioning him that night and in the following days when he was sober, the man never gave actual reasons for his actions. Brandon was unsure how to feel about it. Part of him saw it as just some crazy guy that had no reason, so why worry? But then a part of him thought of the look in the man's eyes and the chilling fact that he chose to attack the door rather than run. That defiance had to have been driven by a reason. And either way, if the man had gotten in, what he would have tried to do to Brandon was likely just as horrifying, reason or not. As far as Brandon knew, the man was only imprisoned for a few weeks due to not being sober during his actions. So now Brandon was left to just worry about whether or not the man intended on coming back. The man on the overlook. This happened to Ashley in the fall of 2018. She was 22, and at the time she was living temporarily on the East Coast, right outside the Appalachian mountain range. Ashley would readily admit she had never been much of an outdoorsy person and had no real experience in camping or anything like that. However, this was her last year living in arguably the best place to explore the outdoors. With it being mid-fall, the trees displaying their stunning colors and the weather being perfect, she figured this was her one chance to seize the opportunity. She didn't want a huge camping adventure, so she found a simple hiking trail instead that promised some good mountain views. She prepped a small backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit. When she arrived, the small dirt parking area was empty. She guessed the trail wasn't as popular as she'd thought. Ashley parked and started walking. It was calm, and it definitely didn't feel like a path a lot of people would take. There weren't any noticeable recent shoe prints in the dirt. It was just a small path with trees on either side. As she got further in, the entire path became more densely covered in trees, enough to block out a lot of the sun and make the whole trail shaded. It was actually really nice and cooling, but not hearing or seeing anyone else became more of an unsettling thought the farther out she got. Not in a creepy way, but just the realization that she was entirely alone, a sensation she was absolutely not used to. About an hour or maybe even 2 hours down the trail, she was caught off guard by seeing a man ahead of her. He was sitting on the side, seemingly taking a break under one of the trees. As she passed him, Ashley gave a friendly nod and said hi. He looked up at her and said nothing. He didn't smile or nod. He just held an unblinking, vacant stare for a few seconds before she quickly looked away. Ashley wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe he didn't hear her, but the strange, empty look was definitely unsettling. She walked a bit faster for the next part of the trail, hoping to put some distance between them. After another hour, she slowed down and finally reached the end, which was an overlook of the mountains. The fall colors made the view way better than it probably would have been any other time of year, and overall, she was glad to have made the hike. She stared off into the distance for a few minutes, enjoying a view she almost never got to see. But when she turned around to leave, her heart leapt into her throat. The man from earlier was standing right at the end of the trail. He was only 10 feet from her, and the fact that she never heard his approach was terrifying. After the initial scare, she realized how creepy it was that he was just standing there and not coming up to look out at the overlook like a normal person. But then he did something even more odd. His face shifted, a slow, unnatural grin spread across his features as he finally spoke, asking her how the view was. "Yeah, it's really nice. You should take a look too," she responded, trying to be polite but still deeply confused. The man stepped closer, then pointed to her right and said, "There was an even better view down that trail." Ashley looked over her shoulder to where he was pointing. There was a path, barely visible, going through the dense trees. It was rugged and undefined, not something that looked to be used very often. The man walked up to where the path started and stood at the entrance, telling her again about how great the view was and saying it was just a minute or two to walk there. She politely declined, but he continued to press the issue, his voice insistent. It was suddenly blatantly obvious that his intentions were far darker than simply wanting her to see a nice view. Ashley said she was okay and had to get home, then started to walk toward the main trail, but the man was quick to move his body in front of it. She stopped in place, now even more terrified and thinking of the possible intentions of this man, who was just a few feet from her, in the middle of an empty forest. The man looked at her with an impassive stare. She took a few steps, walking around him, her body tense and ready to run, just hoping that nothing would escalate. And for some miraculous reason, it didn't. The man watched her as she made her way around him and down the trail. Every time she looked back, he was still watching her, making no attempt to be discreet. Thankfully, he didn't follow, and Ashley made it back to her car. She didn't know what that man was trying to do, but it was almost surely not anything good. What was down that path likely was just a dead end somewhere for him to lead her before doing whatever horrible thing he had in mind. She didn't know why he didn't stop her from leaving either. Maybe he was worried about doing something on the main trail. All she could say was that she was lucky to have gotten out before something else happened. The far side of the maze. During October in Samuel's town, there was always this huge Halloween fair set up on a farm. He had been there a couple of times with his family when he was younger, but this was his first time going alone with just his friends. They were in high school and thought it would be fun to walk around and just have a few laughs while soaking up the Halloween vibes. The place was open late the whole week leading up to Halloween, so they went on a weekday night around 8 p.m. They must have chosen an odd day and time though, because most of the families had already cleared out. The entire fair felt eerie and sparse. Only a few groups of kids their age were still running around. Regardless, they still had fun. They played some of the random games and messed around a bit, until one of Samuel's friends suggested they check out the corn maze. None of them hesitated to run in and try to get as lost as possible. That was until they somehow split into two groups. 3 of them ran off one way, and Samuel was left with his buddy Micah. Seeing as it was a maze, there was no use in trying to chase after the others. The 2 of them went their own way for a few minutes, then started trying to find the way out. During the 10 or so minutes they spent walking around, they never heard or ran into any of the others from the group, which made Samuel wonder how big the maze actually was. At some point, he and Micah were getting tired of it and really started trying to find the exit. Whenever there were multiple paths, they would foolishly split up and check if either was a dead end, then come back and choose the best one. But on one of these random crossroads, Micah didn't come back. Samuel waited for at least 2 or 3 minutes without hearing or seeing him, until he heard footsteps coming from farther down the path. He waited for Micah to reappear, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate, and too rhythmic to be his. A moment later, a towering man came around the path and walked up to him. The stranger was wearing farmer-type clothes overalls, a flannel shirt, and boots, looking like all the other employees at the fair. The man said it was closing for the night and that he would take Samuel out of the maze. Samuel told him his friends were still inside as well, but the man replied that he had already shown them out, which suddenly made everything else make sense. Samuel followed him, going around multiple turns and corners. But strangely, the sound of the fair began to recede, getting quieter and quieter. A creeping sense of unease settled in as the cheerful noise faded completely. It was just Samuel and this man, walking through a dead silent corn maze. Then they reached what appeared to be a dead end. Samuel stopped, watching as the man roughly pulled aside the corn stalks and started pushing his way through the dense vegetation, urging him to follow. He did as he was told, walking through it, following closely behind until the corn abruptly stopped and turned into an empty field. As Samuel looked around, he realized this was the far side of the cornfield, facing away from the town and civilization. Right in front of him, a dark sedan was parked in the field, engine idling, headlights off. His breathing instantly became shallow, and his heart rate spiked with pure dread. In an instant, the man quickly spun around and lunged at him. Samuel reacted fast enough, jerking away and scrambling back into the maze. As he sprinted back onto the path, he heard the man forcing his way through the corn again and following right behind him. He started going straight through all of it, just trying to get back to the fair where hopefully someone could help him. This seemed to work, as the man never caught up. When Samuel finally made it out, his whole friend group was standing at the entrance waiting for him. It wasn't really clear what had happened, but Micah said he came back for Samuel and couldn't find him. None of them had seen the man, and almost didn't believe Samuel until he called the police. All they found were tire tracks in the grass. No car or man anywhere. Had Samuel stayed in that field for even a second longer or hesitated when the man turned, he would have been in that car. What was going on there remained a mystery, but he knew if they had stayed to find out, they might have never left. Alone in the fall woods. It was finally fall, which for Nathan meant camping season. The forests around there turned yellow and orange, and the air was crisp, clean, and slightly breezy. Nathan really didn't know why more people didn't go outside around this time, but he wasn't complaining about having the trails to himself. That year, he went on a familiar trail with a campsite that was always empty. It was right in the middle of the forest, and usually it wasn't all that special, but with the fall-colored trees, the view was breathtaking. When he got there, he unpacked and went right away to gather some kindling for the campfire. It was around 4, so he had a good 3 hours before sunset. He was walking around the area picking up the driest kindling he could find, and at one point he looked up and instantly froze. There was a man standing among the trees, maybe 30 feet from him. The man was just watching Nathan with a chilling, completely vacant stare. He was fairly tall, wearing a flannel coat and jeans. Nathan waved, but the man just backed up and walked away. He seemed to disappear deeper into the forest, into a direction that was nothing but trees. Seeing him just walking around was kind of unsettling, as Nathan didn't know what else he could have been doing out there other than camping. Nathan made sure to keep watch around the campsite for the next little while. However, the constant rush of the wind and clatter of dried leaves made it impossible to hear anything. It was like wearing earplugs, a terrifying sensory deprivation that left him feeling completely exposed. Inevitably, the sun went down. He got the fire going, but what he was hoping to be a peaceful night became unsettling and creepy as the forest grew darker. At least the fire was lighting up the area, but he still had a bad feeling about the man. Nathan couldn't help but constantly look in all directions, sometimes feeling like he could see a shadow of a person standing just outside of his camp, but it was almost pitch black, so he couldn't tell for sure. After an hour, the night got colder than he expected, so he moved inside his tent and bundled up in his sleeping bag. The campfire slowly fizzled out over the next 30 minutes, and he was able to calm down enough to fall asleep. Nathan didn't think he was asleep for long, though. He woke up very quickly, like his eyes just snapped open. He stayed lying down for a second, not sure if he'd woken up to something or if he just happened to wake up. All he could hear were the leaves blowing into the side of his tent and the trees calmly swaying around him. But then, through the noise of the leaves, his hearing locked onto a specific sound, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps, one after the other. Someone was walking around outside his tent, and they were circling. He sat up, and panic seized his mind. All he could think about was his utter vulnerability, sitting inside this flimsy, tent-a-thin layer of nylon separating him from whatever was out there. So he did what felt like his only option. Nathan quickly grabbed his bag, unzipped the tent, and ran out. When he did, he ran straight into him. The man was standing less than 5 feet from the tent opening. Nathan instantly recognized the same chilling, vacant stare, the man from earlier. The most unsettling thing about it, the man didn't even flinch. He simply stood there watching Nathan, as if he were waiting for him to make the next move. Nathan didn't hesitate. He turned and booked it blindly into the woods. Again, it was oppressive darkness, and the wind, along with the crunching leaves under his feet, made it nearly impossible to hear. So Nathan honestly couldn't say if the man chased him or not. Something was definitely on his side that night, though, because he happened to stumble across a part of the trail that he recognized, even in the dark. From there, he followed it back to the road. He never went back for his tent, as he was absolutely terrified of that part of the forest now. Maybe he was overreacting, but Nathan really thought that man was going to take his life that night. It was just a gut feeling, he guessed. Either way, Nathan knew he'd never be camping out in those woods again.